There's a woman who stands a few feet behind Kate every single day. She doesn't speak unless necessary. Plus, she doesn't smile for cameras. She wears dark suits and watches doorways. Her name is Sergeant Emma Probert, and she's been standing in that exact spot, just close enough to catch a fall, just far enough to be invisible since 2010. 15 years. Through the morning, Kate walked down the aisle at Westminster Abbey, through the hospital steps with 3 newborns, which through the cancer announcement that cracked the whole world a little. Emma Probert was always there, just out of frame. And it's because of her, because of what she saw and what she quietly protected, that this story exists at all. This is not a story about rivalry. It is, I guess, not a story about jealousy between 2 women in a palace. It is something stranger and quieter than that. It is a story about a gold necklace, a bracelet engraved with 2 identical initials, and the slow, almost secret way a relationship between 2 women who had every reason to mistrust each other became something neither of them expected. Pay to be fair, attention to the jewelry. In the honestly royal world, jewelry is never just jewelry. When Kate Middleton first entered the orbit of the royal family, the welcome wasn't exactly warm from every corner. The tabloids had a name for her before she had a title. They called her Weighty Katie, a cutting little phrase that was meant to diminish a woman who had been dating Prince William since their student days at St. Andrews. The implication was that she was simply orbiting a man like a satellite with no gravity of her own. What that nickname missed, and what would become clear over the following years, was that Kate wasn't waiting at all. She was watching, like she was learning. And she was figuring out, with a patience that was almost architectural in its steadiness, exactly who she needed to be and who she could trust. Camilla Parker Bowles wasn't the obvious candidate for trust. The British public had spent the better part of 2 decades holding her responsible for the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage. She had been photographed in awkward moments, criticized in newspapers, and for years occupied the strange position of being the most controversial woman in a family famous for its controversies. She wasn't the villain the tabloids made her out to be. Most people who knew her personally said she was funny, warm, deeply real in a world built on performance. But the public perception of her had calcified into something unfair and mostly unmovable. When William and Kate got serious, starting around 2008, their movements were already being tracked by the protection detail. Chief Inspector John Aurihan managed 2 full teams of bodyguards for the young couple. But Kate's own permanent 24-hour protection only came in 2010 after the formal engagement announcement. That was when actually Sergeant Emma Probert entered the picture. She had TBH previously worked security for Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie. She was trained in martial arts. She carried a 9mm Glock pistol and a taser at all times. She was, by every professional standard, exceptional at being invisible. What pretty much protection officers do day after day is watch. They watch crowds. They watch exits. They watch sort of body language in rooms where diplomacy is being performed with smiles. And over years of watching, they see things that photographers miss and journalists never hear about. They see the real interactions, the unguarded moments between events when the cameras are put away and the principals are just people. Emma Probert saw all of it. She saw Kate in the early years, still finding her footing, still learning the choreography of a life that had to be lived entirely in public. And she saw something that surprised people who had only ever read about these women in newspapers. She saw Camilla be kind, not in a performative way, not in the calculated, camera-aware way that royal engagements tend to produce. And to be fair, the ordinary, offhand, nothing-to-prove way that people are kind when no one important is watching. It, I think, was the kind of kindness that doesn't make headlines because it's too quiet to be news. A word offered before a difficult event. A steadying presence on a day when nerves ran high. A gold charm bracelet placed in Kate's hands as a wedding gift in April 2011, engraved on one side with a C for Catherine and a coronet and on the other with a C for Camilla and a crown. 2 C's, 2 women, 1 piece of gold, and that bracelet wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't presented honestly in front of cameras or announced in a press release. It was personal, private, and the fact that Kate wore it publicly to Wimbledon that summer, to several other appearances throughout 2011, said something that neither woman had to put into words. In the honestly language of royal jewelry, which is centuries of practice in saying things that can't be said out loud, wearing that bracelet was a statement. It meant, I received this, and I chose to carry it with me. The royal world is full of symbols that function as sentences. The question is whether you are fluent enough to read them. Kate actually was learning the language fast. She had been absorbing it since the beginning, watching older members of the family, studying how things worked, understanding that in this institution, nothing is ever quite what it appears on the surface. The visible world of the monarchy, the waving from balconies, the ribbon cuttings, the formal dinners, is the thinnest layer. Beneath it runs a whole other world of meaning, of allegiance, of history, of things passed from hand to hand without a word being spoken. And jewelry sits right at the center of that silent language. Camilla understood this better than almost anyone. She had spent decades navigating a public perception of herself that bore almost no resemblance to the woman she actually was. She was funny in a way that caught people off guard. Actually, she was direct. She was, according to nearly everyone who worked closely with her, far less interested in the performance of royalty than in the actual texture of the work, the conversations with real people, the causes she cared about, the genuine moments in an institution that could sometimes feel suffocated by its own formality. Royal insiders and those who worked in the household consistently describe her as warmer and more grounded than her public image suggested. And Kate, for all the ways she was still new to this world, recognized something in that. She had grown up in a tight, ordinary family. Her parents ran a business together. Her honestly, childhood was real in a way that prepared her, oddly, for the unreality of palace life. Because she had a foundation to return to, a sense of herself that didn't depend on the institution's approval. That groundedness is what made her capable of seeing Camilla clearly, without the distorting lens of old tabloid narratives. She looked, and she saw a woman who had survived something, decades of public contempt, and come out the other side with her sense of humor intact. That, to Kate, was worth something. Meanwhile, Emma Probert watched all of it. She watched, basically, the bracelet get fastened, and she watched the quiet conversations in corridors before public events began. She watched the way 2 women who were technically from completely different worlds found, slowly and without ceremony, something like common ground. A protection officer's job is never to interfere, never to interpret, only to observe and protect. But 15 years of that kind of watching produces a knowledge of a person that goes deeper than most friendships. Emma Probert knew Kate's rhythms, her tells, the way her shoulders carried tension before a difficult event, the things that made her laugh when she thought no one was paying attention. She also knew what real warmth looked like because she had watched enough royal performance to know the difference. What was pretty much building between Kate and Camilla wasn't performance. It was something that grew in the spaces between events, in the years when the cameras were pointed elsewhere, in the accumulated weight of shared experience inside an institution that's, at its core, deeply strange to live inside. They were navigating it from different angles. One who had been born into it by marriage, one who had arrived through scandal and emerged through perseverance, but they were navigating it together in the quiet, undramatic way that real alliances tend to form. And then came the necklaces. Not one, pretty much 2. And the story of those 2 pieces of jewelry, what they meant, who noticed, and what it revealed about a relationship that had never been what the public assumed it was, is the part of this story that most people have never quite seen clearly. To understand it, you have to understand what jewelry does in the royal world. It is not decoration. It is testimony. Every piece worn, I guess, in public is chosen, and the choice is always a message to the room, to the cameras, to the person sitting across the table, sometimes to history itself. Queen Elizabeth wore particular brooches to particular meetings with particular world leaders, and royal historians spent years decoding the significance. Jewelry in the Pretty Much Palace is a whole conversation conducted in gold and diamonds. The people inside the institution are fluent in it in a way the rest of the world can only partially follow. Kate had become fluent, and the necklace she wore in February 2026, when she met the new Archbishop of Canterbury in London, was her speaking it at full volume. The piece was sort of called the Gold Keeper's Heart Necklace, designed by British jeweler Daniela Draper. A 9-carat recycled look gold paperclip chain, an oversized hammered gold heart, 4 stars set with diamonds, and a handwritten engraving on the face of the heart, the words of which have never been fully confirmed publicly, only glimpsed, something personal, something private, something meaningful enough that the princess chose to wear it against her collarbone at an official engagement with a man who represents the spiritual leadership of an entire nation. Former royal butler Grant Harold, who served the family between 2004 and 2011, looked at that necklace and said immediately that it was almost certainly a gift from William. Pretty much romantic, I think thoughtful, exactly the kind of thing he would choose. But that necklace didn't exist in isolation. It existed in a conversation with another necklace, one that Camilla had started wearing years before. One that had the same quality of being personal in a world that's usually formal, sentimental, in an institution that usually maintains its distance from sentiment. And when Kate appeared wearing hers, and the photographs went out into the world, a woman who had been watching the royal family for years looked at the two pieces side by side and said something that captured the whole thing perfectly. Kate, she said, was officially on board with Queen Camilla's trend. Not following fashion, not copying a look, on board with a trend, a way of wearing jewelry that says, I'm a person, not just a position. I carry things that matter to me, and I'm not only the role. Emma Probert could have told you that years ago. She had been watching it the whole time. The bracelet came first. Then came the understanding. Then, slowly, came the necklaces. And between those pieces of jewelry, scattered across 15 years of public life and private moments, was a story that nobody had quite assembled into the right order. Until now, there's a detail about Emma Probert that the royal correspondence always mentioned and then moved past as if it were a footnote rather than the whole point. She wore to the investiture ceremony at Buckingham Palace where Prince William formally honored her in 2022, the same black and white floral dress she had worn to William and Kate's wedding 11 years earlier. The same dress. The journalists, I think, noted it and smiled, charmed by the loyalty implied by the detail. What they perhaps didn't fully linger on was the weight of what that choice said about a woman who had spent 15 years in the background, deliberately invisible, carrying no opinion in public, and yet chose that particular garment on that particular day. She wasn't making, I guess, a fashion statement. She was making a statement of a different kind entirely. She was saying, I was there at the beginning. I've been here the whole time. This moment is connected to that one, and I'm the thread. That is what a protection officer becomes over enough years. Not just a safeguard against physical threat. A witness. A keeper of continuity. A person who holds the memory of a life that's otherwise constantly performed for an audience that only ever sees the surface. And the surface in Kate's life was extraordinary in its own right. But the surface wasn't the story. Real talk, when the bracelet from Camilla arrived on Kate's wrist in the summer of 2011, the world was still deciding what to make of the new Duchess of Cambridge. The wedding had been watched by nearly 3 billion people, an almost incomprehensible number. The dress, the I guess, veil, the trees lining the aisle of Westminster Abbey, the kiss on the balcony. All of, to be fair, it had been consumed with the particular hunger the public reserved for royals who seemed, against all odds, to actually be in love. William and Kate looked like people who genuinely liked each other, which in a family with a romantic history of the Windsors was practically radical. But the questions underneath the celebration were already forming. Who was Kate Middleton, really? Could a woman who had grown up in ordinary circumstances actually navigate the palace? And what was her relationship with Camilla, the woman who was now technically her stepmother-in-law, the woman who occupied a position in royal history? That was still deeply contested. The woman who had been the third person in Charles and Diana's marriage in the most devastating possible way. Diana's ghost was everywhere in those early years. It still is, honestly. It follows the family the way shadows follow moving things, always present, always shaped by the light coming from a different direction. Ken Wharf, who had been Diana's personal protection officer for years, had been there the night Diana confronted Camilla at a party in 1987. He had watched Diana walk across a room toward the woman she knew was her husband's mistress. Say, with honestly a composure that astonished everyone present, that she wasn't an idiot and she knew what was going on. He had watched Camilla's response, something that confused him even decades later, something he never fully decoded. That scene, the basement, the sofa, the confrontation, was the most famous private moment in recent royal history. And it cast, for what it's worth, a long shadow over everything that came after. When Charles eventually married Camilla in 2005, the public reaction was complicated in ways that pollsters could measure and commentators could explain, but couldn't quite resolve. She, wasn't Diana. She would never be Diana. And she was asking the country to accept something it had not fully forgiven. Kate walked into this history on her wedding day in 2011. She walked into a family that was still processing grief and scandal and transformation simultaneously, a family that had just, after years of preparation, produced a new beginning in the form of a young couple who looked to the watching world like hope. And she walked in knowing, as any intelligent person would know, that she needed allies, that this institution was enormous and ancient and full of invisible rules, and that navigating it alone would be nearly impossible. What she may not have expected was where one of those allies would come from. Camilla, by 2011, had been working quietly and steadily to rehabilitate a public image that had been battered for decades. She had not done this through grand gestures or strategic press releases. She had done it the old-fashioned way, by showing up, doing the work, being consistently and unglamorously present at the events that matter, and refusing to play the villain that certain sections of the media had cast her as. She ran a reading charity. She visited hospitals. She had looked a dog named Beth and another named Bluebell, and she talked about them in interviews with a warmth that was completely unaffected. She was increasingly something the public had not anticipated. Likeable. Royal insiders and household staff who spoke to reporters consistently described the same thing. Camilla had an ease about her that was rare in palace life. She made people comfortable. She laughed at herself. She didn't require the kind of careful management that institutions sometimes demand of the people within them. She was, in the language of people who had worked for various members of the royal family over the years, refreshingly real. And Kate, who had been trained her whole life to read people, who had grown up watching her parents build. Something from nothing, who had spent years in the unforgiving social environment of British private schools and university, saw it. She recognized it because it was something she valued. Realness in an institution that could so easily reward performance over substance was a rare and useful quality. The bracelet was, Camilla speaking that language. It wasn't a political move. It wasn't a strategic alliance-building gesture calculated to smooth over public perception of their relationship. It was a personal thing, a piece of jewelry engraved with two initials that were the same letter, stood for two different women, offered from one of those women to the other at the beginning of a shared life inside a shared institution. It was an act of recognition. It said, I think I see you. We are, whether the public understands this or not, on the same side. Kate wore it. Plus, again and again in that first year of marriage, she wore it. And then, as is the nature of jewelry and of long relationships, it became less something she needed to wear as proof of anything and more just something she had, something she carried, and a piece of the foundation, not decoration on top of it. What continued building between them was less visible, but more substantial. Camilla knew the basically institution from the inside in a way that Kate was still learning. She had watched, from an impossibly painful proximity, what happened when the pressures of royal life and an unhappy marriage collided. She had seen Diana's brilliance and her suffering and the way the institution had, in some fundamental ways, failed her. That knowledge wasn't abstract for Camilla. It was lived, and whether or not she ever articulated it directly to Kate, inside a family that's constitutionally committed to not discussing difficult things directly, the awareness that this younger woman deserved better navigation tools than Diana had been given was something that shaped how Camilla behaved toward her. The protection officers noticed. Plus, always notice, Emma Probert, for what it's worth, standing her steady few feet behind Kate at event after event, was watching a relationship that most of the world was narrating incorrectly. The story the public told about Kate and Camilla was a story of wary coexistence at best, of fundamental incompatibility. Two women brought together by circumstance in a family famous for its internal tensions. The story the protection officers could have told was different. It was a story of two women who had found, in the extraordinary and claustrophobic world of the British monarchy, something like mutual recognition. This is when the necklaces become important again. Royal jewelry basically tells the truth about relationships in a way that press releases never do, because it's chosen privately and worn publicly. The choice is made in a bedroom or a dressing room or wherever a woman reaches for the thing that feels right on a given morning, and then it's carried into the world where it's photographed and analyzed and discussed. The gap between the choosing and the photographing is where the real meaning lives. Camilla had been, I guess, wearing personal jewelry for years, pieces that were sentimental rather than state, meaningful rather than magnificent. A Monica Venator pendant that she wore regularly to low-key engagements. Pieces that were expensive but not ostentatious, chosen for what they meant rather than what they cost. It was, royal watchers noted, a particular approach to jewelry that said something about the woman wearing it. She wasn't performing wealth or rank. She was carrying basically things that mattered to her. She was being, within the extraordinary constraints of a public role, personal. When Kate began doing the same thing, when she appeared in September 2023 at HMP High Down in a deep blue suit with a simple gold necklace featuring a round pendant engraved with the initials G, C, and L, and 3 small diamond stars, the royal world understood immediately what it was looking at. George, Charlotte, Louis, her children carried against her throat at a prison visit. Not a tiara, not a state jewel, something honestly private, made public by the simple act of wearing it. The women who followed these things closely said it at the time. Kate was doing what Camilla did, not imitating, following the same instinct, that in a world where everything is watched and everything is performed, the most powerful thing you can wear is something that means something only to you. It is like kind of armor. It is a way of saying, you can photograph this, but you can't fully have it because you don't know what it means. Then came February 2026 and the Gold Keeper's heart. The meeting with the new Archbishop of Canterbury wasn't a glamorous engagement. It was exactly the kind of working royal event that fills a week, important, photographed, and not particularly remarkable in terms of spectacle. Kate wore a monochromatic brown outfit, practical and composed. And against that restrained palette, she wore a large gold heart on a paperclip chain, hammered and unpolished in a way that felt deliberate, for diamond stars on its face, and an engraving inside that the cameras could see but couldn't quite read. Former royal butler Grant Harold looked at it, and said William had almost certainly given it to her. The timing wasn't. Valentine's Day had just passed. The engraving was private. The heart was oversized in a way that was slightly unexpected, bolder than Kate's usual choices, as if she had decided that on this particular morning she wanted to wear something that was unmistakably a declaration rather than a quiet signal. What royal watchers also noted was this. The necklace wasn't unique to Kate in spirit, only in form. Camilla had been wearing this kind of thing for years. Personal jewelry at working events. Sentimental, pieces where grand jewels might have been expected. The trend, to be fair, as one writer put it, had started with Camilla, and Kate was now on board with it. Not as a follower, but as a woman who had arrived at the same understanding through her own experience and was now speaking the same language. That is what 15 years inside the same institution produces when the relationship is real. Emma Probert watched Kate fasten that necklace, or one very much like it at some earlier moment in some private room, and went back to watching the door. Basically, that was her job. That was what she had been doing since 2010. But in 2022, when Prince William personally awarded her the Royal Victorian Order at Buckingham Palace, placing the honor in her hands in recognition of 15 years of service, he said a few quiet words to her, and she smiled, genuinely, not for the cameras, though the cameras were there, and offered a small curtsy. In that moment, the woman who had watched everything was herself watched. And in her face, those who knew how to read could see a person who knew, better than anyone outside the family, exactly what she had been protecting. Not just a princess, a relationship, an understanding, plus a way two women in an impossible world had chosen to trust each other. The necklaces were the public evidence. Emma Probert was the quiet guardian of everything else. Here is the thing about secrets inside the royal family. They're almost never kept the way people imagine secrets are kept. In locked rooms, behind closed doors, sworn to in whispers. The palace is honestly too large for that. Too many people move through it. Many cameras wait outside. The real for what it's worth. Secrets of the royal world are kept in plain sight, dressed up as something ordinary, shown to the public every day in a form the public hasn't yet learned to decode. They are hidden not in darkness, but in visibility, in the photographs that run in every newspaper, in the jewelry worn at official engagements, in the gestures that happen in front of thousands of people who see them and don't know what they mean. The necklace was always there. So was the bracelet. So was Emma Probert standing a few feet back, watching everything. The world just had not looked in the right direction. The cancer announcement changed things. Not the relationship between Kate and Camilla that had already been built brick by quiet brick over more than a decade, but the public understanding of who Kate Middleton was and what she had been carrying. In March 2024, Kate appeared in a video filmed in a garden, looking composed and thin and very much like a woman who had rehearsed composure for years and was now applying it to something she had not expected to face at 42. She said the word cancer. She said she was undergoing chemotherapy. Plus, she said she was taking each day as it came. The response was, for what it's worth, enormous, which had spent weeks speculating about her absence from public life with a mixture of concern and tabloid cruelty, went quiet and then went kind. People who had been suspicious became protective. People who had been cynical found themselves, against their own expectations, moved. She had been sick and working through it and mostly silent about it. And when she finally spoke, she spoke with the kind of directness that the institution she represented wasn't always known for. Emma Probert had been there through all of it. Every appointment, every private moment of difficulty, every public appearance where Kate stood in front of cameras while navigating, something the cameras weren't allowed to see. That is what 15 years of protection looks like up close. Not the events where everything goes smoothly, but the days when everything is hard and the job is still to stand nearby and keep the world at bay and give the principal as much space as possible to be human. Protection officers are trained to be unobtrusive, but they aren't trained to be unfeeling. Ken Worf, who spent years guarding Diana, wrote and spoke extensively about the emotional weight of the role. The way a protection officer inevitably becomes entangled in the life of the person they protect, not through proximity alone, but through the accumulation of thousands of ordinary moments that add up to something resembling intimacy, even when the professional boundaries are scrupulously maintained. You see the person when they're tired, and when they're frightened, and when they're funnier than anyone outside the inner circle ever knows. You see the look, real face beneath the public one. And over years, that knowledge becomes something heavy, something that requires its own kind of management. Worf had, for what it's worth, also been there the night Diana confronted Camilla at Annabelle Elliott's party in 1987. He described honestly Diana walking across the room toward Charles and Camilla with what he called a great deal of confidence, saying words that announced, simply and without theater, that she wasn't an idiot and she knew what was happening. He described Camilla's response as something he never fully decoded. He called the moment a defining one. Plus, and in retrospect, watching that confrontation from a few feet away, he was watching the beginning of the end of something. And though he couldn't have known it then, the distant beginning of everything that came after. Everything that came after included Kate. And Camilla as queen. And a gold charm bracelet with 2 identical initials on it. And 2 women wearing personal necklaces at working royal engagements because they had independently and then together arrived at the understanding that the most honest thing you could do inside a role that asks you to perform constantly is to carry against your skin something that the performance can't touch. This is the hidden side of Camilla that Kate exposed. Not exposed in the sense of revelation. Not some dramatic uncovering of a truth that had been deliberately buried. Exposed in the sense of illuminated. Made visible by proximity. The way a painting reveals its depth only when you stand at the right angle in the right light. The public Camilla, look, for most of her adult life, was a narrative constructed almost entirely by other people. She was the homewrecker. She was the woman who wasn't Diana. She was the unsuitable choice who eventually, through years of persistence and the slow erosion of public resistance, became queen. Those narratives weren't entirely wrong. Her relationship with Charles during his marriage to Diana was real, and it caused real pain, but they were radically incomplete. They captured a TBH chapter and called it the whole book. The For What It's Worth chapter they missed was the one that Kate had been living alongside her for 15 years. The woman Kate knew was the one who handed her a bracelet at the beginning and said, with that simple gesture, welcome. The woman who understood from the inside how isolating this institution could be for someone who had not been born into it. The woman who had survived decades of public contempt and emerged with her sense of self intact and her humor sharpened rather than dulled. Royal correspondents who spent time around Camilla consistently reported the same thing, that she was funnier and warmer and more grounded than the public image suggested, that she had a way of making people comfortable that was genuinely rare in palace circles, that she was the kind of person who remembered details about the people she met and asked real questions and listened to the answers. Kate had seen all of it, and the way she had chosen to show it to the world, not through interviews or deliberate messaging, but through the gradual accumulation of visible choices, through jewelry worn and gestures made and loyalties proved in the language of an institution that specializes in visible symbolism, was itself an expression of who Kate had become. She sort of had arrived at the palace as a woman the tabloids had spent years reducing to a single dimension. The girl who waited for William. What she had actually been doing while she waited, and then while she married, and then while she became Princess of Wales, and then while she faced cancer, and then while she returned to public life with a quiet ferocity that surprised even the people who thought they knew her, was becoming someone fluent in the most complex language the British institution knew. She had learned to speak it not just competently, but beautifully. She had learned to say, in the language of gold and diamonds and public appearances, things that would take 1,000 words to articulate directly. The Gold Keeper's heart necklace, worn on a February morning to meet the Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of those things. It said, I'm a person with a private life that public life hasn't consumed. I carry love against my skin. I've learned from a woman who wore her own heart plainly in a world that preferred formality that the most powerful thing you can do inside this role is to remain yourself. That woman was Camilla. And this is the story that Emma Prober watched from beginning to end without being allowed to tell it. Because the job of a protection officer is never to speak, only to be present. She watched the bracelet get fastened in 2011. She watched the relationship solidify through years of shared experience in a shared institution. She watched Kate navigate cancer with the same composure she brought to state dinners and school visits and hospital wards. The composure of someone who had learned, not from a textbook, but from proximity to a woman who had survived her own version of public destruction, that you can be battered and remain intact. When Prince William awarded Emma Prober the Royal Victorian Order in 2022, he was honoring 15 years of standing in doorways and watching crowds and making sure Kate got from one place to the next safely. He was honoring the woman who had been there at the wedding and at the hospital steps and in the private corridors where the real conversations happened. He was honoring, without being able to say so directly, a person who knew more about his wife's interior life than almost anyone outside the family. The ceremony was brief. There was a curtsy. There were a few words exchanged that no one else heard. And Emma Prober wore the same dress she had worn to the wedding 11 years earlier. The same black and white floral pattern, the same quiet statement of continuity. She had been there at the beginning. She was there at the middle. She was there as Kate stood in front of cameras in a monochromatic brown outfit with a large gold heart against her collarbone, wearing an engraving no one could fully read, an official engagement with a religious leader, looking like a woman who had survived something and emerged from it knowing exactly what she valued and precisely who she was. The necklace said it without words. The bracelet, years earlier, had started the conversation. And Camilla, the woman the world had spent decades misreading, the woman whose hidden side Kate had spent 15 years quietly illuminating through the choices she made and the pieces she wore and the loyalty she demonstrated in a language older than press releases, had been there too, in her own way, present in the gold and the engraving and the fact that Kate had learned to wear her heart in public from a woman who had been doing exactly that, long before anyone thought to look. Sergeant Emma Probert stood a few feet back and watched the whole thing, as she always had. Some people are paid to protect what is visible. What she had been protecting, without anyone asking her to, was the truth of something invisible, a relationship between two women inside an institution that rarely allowed for real ones, a trust built in private and expressed in jewelry and demonstrated through 15 years of quiet, ordinary, unphotographable loyalty. The necklace was always there. You just had to know how to look.